Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Thank you for joining me in another painting demo. Today we're going to look at this airplane painting that I painted, which is also one of my favorite paintings. So I took this photo a few years back when I was visiting Singapore, and this photo was taken the day I departed for my return trip. I was waiting to board the plane, and the view outside the window while I was waiting really caught my eyes, so I took a photo of it. And it's funny because I haven't started painting watercolor during that time, but this photo has always been very special to me. And I wanted to paint this painting for a very long time, but it wasn't until early this year that I had the confidence to tackle this. I'm really happy with the result, even though I believe it can always be better. The airplane is definitely the main focus of the painting. And anytime you have a large-scale, hard surface object like this, the most important things are the perspective, the surface material, and the scale. The surface material is rendered during the painting stage, so during the drawing stage here, we really just need to nail down the perspective and the scale. And as you can see, the first thing I do after I block out the basic composition of the painting is to start drawing the airplane. I started drawing the airplane by simplifying it down to the basic primitive form. So in this case, I make it into a cylinder with a rounded tip at the end. And when you are able to simplify your subject down to a combination of primitives, you start to realize that it isn't really that complicated. As long as you can see things in a three-dimensional way in perspective, you will be able to do a believable drawing. I started off with just fast, loose, long lines. After I familiar myself and have a better grasp of form, I started to tighten up my drawing and give it some more definition, just to give it some more defined, darker marks. And as you can see, I drew quite a bit of construction lines to help me visualize the 3D form. And as I tightened up my drawing, I started to articulate the shape and detail a bit more. So when you're doing a drawing, start light and loose. Don't cut up with all the details in the photo and learn to read big shapes and forms. And now I started to put details on the body of the airplane. Everything should be following the surface contour of the airplane and the perspective of the scenery. Notice I didn't use a ruler and it doesn't have to be super dead accurate, but the perspective and the form has to be believable. So what I always like to tell people is that if you think about it, if you put into thought when you draw, it usually ends up to be more believable than you just kind of blindly, blatantly copying the photo. Because every drawing and painting shows your understanding of the subject matter that you are drawing and painting. And when you're trying to draw something or paint something that you don't entirely understand or you don't think about it, it's starting to become like you're relying on all the happy accident and hoping that things go right. And that's just not a really good way to do a drawing or a painting. It's very important that you understand what you are drawing and painting, so your end result will be believable. Start to draw the landing gears. And because the landing gear I know is going to be mostly in the dark, so I didn't really put that much detail into it. But it still has to follow the perspective. It needs to feel like the landing gear are actually touching the floor and all the landing gears are on the same platform. You can't have one landing gear is higher and one landing gear is lower, or one landing gear is kind of skewed, and that will feel like the airplane is not standing upright. So that's why I start to draw the perspective line and making sure they are on the same level. Now I start to tighten up and draw the vertical and horizontal stabilizer on the airplane's tail. And notice that I draw quite a bit of contour line. That's just to help me to visualize the form a bit more, but also it will act as a guide when I start to draw and paint the writings and the graphic on the airplane, as well as the reflections, the lighting, and the shadow. It should all be following the form of the airplane. The wing of the airplane. I try not to use a ruler. I mean, there's nothing wrong if you want to use a ruler. Just for me, I think it's a good practice to draw a nice straight line with freehand. And the hatch door of the cargo bay is a little bit tricky, so I'm checking the perspective, trying to make sure if I'm doing it right. The hatch door, when it's closed, it fits right in the airplane's form. So when it closes, you don't really see it, but when it opens upward. So I'm trying to get that curvature in, but also in the right perspective. Now move on to the turbine. Definitely a very important part of the painting. And from that, I start to draw the shape under the wing and start to also draw the lift. In perspective. It's right next to the cargo bay. It's sitting right next to the cargo bay hatch. And then two people are operating that. So these are very, very important because it connects the shape between the turbine and the body of the plane. So for this painting, I am using 1-point perspective. Again, because I'm looking at the airplane straight on. So my eyes are on the horizon and it has a vanishing point right in front of me. And since the airplane is facing me, I decided to make it a 1-point perspective. It's simpler and it's actually more powerful, and it have a better directionality. So this vehicle that's holding the luggage, I believe, I also start to tighten up and start to draw and give it a solid form. And it also follows the perspective, so it's 1-point perspective. I set it right under the vanishing point. And that's also another very important thing. Photo reference is important, but you are doing your own drawing and painting. So when you are drawing, everything should be referenced from your own drawing and perspective. So what I mean is that I set up my horizon line, I have my vanishing point, everything should be following that. Even when it end up doesn't look exactly like the photo, I still need to follow my own drawing. Because the camera lens can be skewed, and in real world, sometimes things are not perfectly in perspective and not perfectly lining up correctly. So when you are doing your own drawing, it's important to follow your own perspective and making sure everything is following that. So that's again why you don't just blatantly copying the photo, because sometimes the photo itself has some things going on that might not work really well in your own painting. So when you set up a horizon, a vanishing point, and when you set up the form of the things in your drawing, in your painting, follow it. Because after the painting is done, unless you show the original photo to the people, nobody's going to see it. They only have your painting to reference from. So if your viewer spotted something weird, even though it can be caused by the photo itself, it doesn't really matter because it's your painting that counts. So I'm just quickly blocking the background and the figures and the cones, some other stuff. And also started drawing some loading pad or whatever that is. And notice how small the figures are because you need to set up the right scale. The figure gives us a very good scale reference because when you see a figure, you have better idea how big things are. So in this case, you can tell the airplanes are really, really big. The vehicles and everything, the lift, they are all really big. As soon as you see the figures, the scale started to become more relatable. And now I start the first wash. So it is very early when I took the photo and there's some pretty dark cloud and it's a little bit raining. So I really want to get that mood in. So I want to make sure that I paint some dark cloud in the background. So I wet the sky with clean water sort of randomly and I mix a mixture that's pretty dark and dry. So when I put it in, it'll stay a little bit more. If I mix a very watery mixture and I do wet on wet, it'll probably get washed off pretty quickly and nothing much left. So I just go back in and start to paint some dark clouds. So because I wet the paper randomly, so I start to hit some dry areas, some wet areas, so I got this variation of soft and hard edges. And while that first wash is still wet, I can change things around, manipulate it. I can soften some edges. I can add some paint, make some part darker. Painting cloud is fun and at the same time pretty stressful because you have very, very little time to play with it. I mean, even though you can do it several layers, nothing really beats when you do everything in one go. It just feels really fresh. So I'm trying to add a little bit more dark cloud. I'm looking at the reference and think about if I need to add more, if I need to take off some of it and start to basically paint the cloud. And mix some more dark colors and use the tip of my brush to give a little bit more definition of some of the cloud. So before this wash is dry, I have limited time to play around with it, to add a little bit more cloud, to lighten some part of the cloud, and so on. I just rotate my paper a little bit so it doesn't just rotate my paper a little bit so the wash doesn't just go down. And our dark cloud is taking form. So one thing to notice is that the cloud on the above is much larger than the ones in the bottom. And the reason is because cloud has perspective too. Just because they're free shapes doesn't mean they don't have any perspective. The clouds in the bottom are smaller because they are further away from you. And as opposed to the cloud that's a little bit higher in the photo, is actually closer to you. That's why they are a lot bigger. Now there are cases that the cloud near the horizon are larger than the one that's actually in front of you, but this painting I wanted to read it very clearly, so that's why we have larger clouds on the above and smaller cloud into the distance. And as I continue to wash down, I try to carefully paint around the background airplane, the places that's going to have highlights. Try not to paint over them, try to preserve those highlights, especially the top of the airplane, the top face of the wing, and the background airplanes. So I start to bring the wash into the airplane body because they are going to be darker, not going to be just white. So I can safely bring the wash in and connect the shape. And since the first wash is usually very light, I can bring the value in without much of a problem. Now while the wash is still wet, I start to give the airplane some color of the light. Now the right side of the airplane is catching some pretty warm light. Okay, I think that warm light is artificial light. I am not quite sure, but it's off the frame. But the important thing is to give it some warm tint to it. And I need to make sure that I do that while it's still wet, so it has a very soft edge and soft transition. And before the wash is dry, I need to move on to the left side of the painting and continue it down as well. If it's dry and I try to go back and paint it, it's going to be a hard edge. So you probably don't want that. For the first wash, even though it is not the most important thing because a lot of things are going to be covered, it is important to think about the overall value. So if you look at the reference photo, and I just blurred it out a little bit and everything become really clear. The airplane itself is actually very light, and the turbine, the lift, and everything under the airplane are pretty dark. So you have a pretty strong positive and negative shape going on there. And definitely the airplanes are much lighter and has harder edge. So that's what I need to preserve while I paint the first wash. So a lot of those dark area I can pretty safely just paint it over because I'm going to paint them darker in later washes anyways. And the more shape you can connect, the better it will look. So painting the turbine and the lift. See, I just pretty much cover up everything and leave a little bit of highlight on the top of the turbine because it's catching the light from the sky. But the rest of it, I can keep it pretty dark. And keep in mind, the first wash usually dry a lot lighter because you use a lot of water. And when there's a lot of water in your wash, the lighter is going to dry. So continue to wash down and preserve the highlight. So it's a 14 by 20 painting, so it's a bigger size painting than what I usually work. My most common size is 12 by 16. There are a lot of artists like to work a lot bigger, but for me, the bigger the painting, the more demanding it is. And especially for watercolor, in order to do a nice clean first wash like this, I really need to be mindful where the wash is, and I really need to keep an eye on the overall dryness of the wash, because I can be caught up by a section of the wash and I start to forget that the other part also need to continue down, and they start to dry, and then I try to go back and paint it and it start to become bad looking, have cauliflower edges, or it's already dry so it become hard edges. And where I don't intend it to. So the bigger the painting, the harder it is, for me at least. So I'm just putting some directional line, similar to a lot of street painting that I do. What I'm basically doing is to clean my brush and squeeze out the water so the brush is pretty damp. And I do this while the wash is still pretty wet. So after the first wash is dry, I re-wet the background where the distant trees are going to be. This gives me the ability to do things wet on wet. And the reason I want to do wet on wet is to push the depths of the background trees into the distance. It is important not to wet into the highlighted area so the trees won't run into where the highlights should be. And now I mix a drier, cool gray color mixture and use the tip of my brush to drop the paint into the wet area. So the tip of the brush will give you a little bit more control. Just make sure you don't press it down hard so the paint won't just go all over the place. And they will just dissolve into wet area and create these wonderful soft shapes. So even though when you see the reference photo, you notice the trees are very dark, we need to make our own decision in our own painting to push them back with lighter value and softer shapes. Continue to bring that second wash down, and we stop it at the edge of the airplane. We really need to preserve that bright highlight and keep the edge sharp. I also made a bit darker as it comes down, just to give a little bit more depth. Now onto the left side, I was able to separate the right and the left because the airplane separates them. Also some wet on wet for the soft shape on the left, but I also started to paint some hard edges for the hangers in the background. They don't have to be very detailed and defined, but they do have to be readable. Bring the second wash down on the left, preserving the white for the puddles on the ground and the airplane. This stage is a little bit tricky because there are a lot of decisions to make, and it is always intimidating when you are starting to paint into some of the area. It feels like going to uncharted territories, and that happens every single painting that I do. But sometimes you just have to hold your breath and go for it and hope for the best. Here I bring that background value into the bottom of the airplane, where the darker value is. This is one of the important things for watercolor, and that is to connect the shape. Connecting shapes keep the painting together and less noisy. While that is still wet, I paint the graphic on the body of the airplane. And as I mentioned before, they need to follow the contour of the airplane. And as this graphic touches the wet wash, they will melt and merge into the other shapes. So you get this interesting hard and soft edges. And that's what watercolor is about, right? You have this lost and found edges that makes the watercolor interesting. In this stage, I really just buckle down and invest my time to render the airplane and the things around it. Since it's the main focus of the painting, it definitely deserves my fullest attention. I'm really trying to get that form and trying to paint out that sharp reflections that a shiny paint on metal has. These are the things that make the airplane what it is, and this is why it is so vital to understand the subject. If you don't understand it, you're just blatantly trying to copy the photo. It's not going to look as believable and as alive as it can be. I started to bring the dark shape down into the lift and other stuff. And this is the part that value grouping is very important. If you look at the reference photo, it is very clear that the airplane body is a lot brighter and wider compared to the ground and the things around it, such as lift, the landing gear, the turbine, and etc. There are a lot of elements in this area. It's a very busy area, but to group them together in the dark will make a very noisy, busy painting into something that's clearly readable. And that is not always easy to do, because when you look at a specific area in the reference, that's all you're going to see in your eyes. Our eyes actually have a very small focus area. And when you look at a specific area in your photo reference, your eyes sort of zoom in and everything else sort of just disappear. So you started to see all sorts of different value and shapes. And if you fall into that trap and start to separate them everywhere in your painting is going to become very noisy, and you actually start to become flat because of all of the details that you make. One good way to counter that is to look at your reference with your eye squint. When you do that, all the details, little details will disappear, and you're able to see your photo reference and a big light and dark relationship. And also for your painting, you should step back once in a while and look at your painting as a whole, if the overall value grouping is correct and if it's readable upon the first glance. And as I mentioned before, detail doesn't make a good painting, a realistic painting. It's about the value relationship, it's about the perspective, it's about the overall believability of your painting, how you're able to render the material, how you're able to interpret the light and the dark, the material and the form. That's what makes a painting believable and realistic, not all the little detail that you put in. If you don't understand the big relationship of the value and the lighting and the material, the detail will actually hurt your painting rather than help it. So as I paint all the dark shapes, I kept a small streak of highlight to suggest just a little bit of separation between the lift and the plane. I also try to paint around the figure carefully, bringing that dark into the turbine and to the front of the plane. And also to the landing gear in the front. Again, connecting all your darks and make it into a single group. Again, watercolor dry lighter, so you will see me adding layers to the dark area to make it darker later on. Now I add another layer of value on the airplane. I only leave the white of the paper on the very top. Even though the airplane body is very light, it still needs just a little bit of value tint to it. I also start to give the jet bridge and the ground a wash as well, taking a break from the detailing and just to go for the big wash into the foreground. Now after everything is dry, I give the dark area another layer. It is important to really punch that dark in. My painting rarely get this dark. Right now this is almost just black. I remember when I'm painting this area, I just keep digging into my neutral tint. Here I'm trying to define the surface of the jet a bit more, especially the form shadow area. Giving that small soft form shadow in the head of the jet is really important. I briefly moved to the leg of the lift because I don't want that part to dry out. I want it to become one clean wash. Now I go back to the nose of the jet to soften the edge of the form shadow so it reads much better as a round tip. Also the transition tone of the airplane. And now we're really starting to see the hard surface quality of the jet. I remember at this stage I started to gain a lot of confidence. Seeing the jet taking form really got me excited, and knowing that the most important element of the painting is going well, I felt a lot more comfortable for the rest of the painting. And sometimes that's just what you need. You need to push through even though when you think you're struggling. And sometimes when you push it through, you see the result and you're happy with it. Give you a lot of moral boost and help you to get through the whole painting. And here I wet basically almost the whole lower right side underneath the jet and the foreground, because I know it's going to be where lots of dark reflection happens. So I wet it pretty well and start to drop in some dark and let it paint itself. I paint tilted about 40 to 45 degrees, so the gravity will pull the pigments down. I started to paint this ground support vehicle, and it's actually pretty simple, just a couple box shape and value. And while at it, I put in the reflection of it as well. And I just use some white gouache for the headlight. Now that the painting is dry again, I started to paint the jet bridge, give it some warmer tone and also make it darker. as well as the right turbine of the plane. It should also be very dark, but that nice little highlight on the rim of the turbine gives a nice suggestion of its form and shape. I wet the area again and try to darken some of the reflections. Now I started to put some details on the jet. This is a 787 jet. Again, all the graphics and the details should be following the contour of the jet. And I ran across the text with a damp, clean brush because I don't want the text to be so clean and readable. It should become part of the jet, not popping out too much. Some windows, dark seams at the nose of the plane and hatch door. Same drill for the jet bridge. Wait till it dry, give it some darker value and details. And we're just slowly building up the whole painting. So I've been very busy for the last couple months. My online course was launched and people who took the course are very happy with the content I put in. There's also a tier that allows students to be part of this close group with me online. I get to do live demo with them every week and answer their question almost real time. It takes quite a bit of my time, but I really enjoy running this course a lot. And I also have more content update planned out that will be adding to the course pretty soon. So besides the public live demo here on the YouTube, this is the first long painting demo I make after the launch of my course. And I do hope you guys enjoy this one. It is one of my favorite paintings, so I'm really excited to show you this one. Now I started to paint the figures. They are really small, but since they are wearing something bright, yellow and orange, and they are standing against the dark background, they pops out really well. And with them standing right next to the jet gives a very nice scale contrast. And since they are small, there's really no need to give it a lot of detail. Just head, body, and pair of legs will do. Give another layer of detail on the vehicle after it's dry. And our third figure here. Now looking at the painting as a whole again, the figure really makes the whole painting look more interesting despite how small they are. It's pretty interesting that something so small can make such a huge difference. Now I add another layer of dark reflection again. It's just not, it still wasn't dark enough. And it's always a struggle for me because I want it to be a soft shape, so I have to do it wet on wet. But the more water you have in your mixture, the lighter it will dry. So a lot of time I have to paint the dark reflection several layers. I'm always practice trying to make as few layers as I can because watercolor just looks fresher that way. But still, the value is very important. If the value is not there, I'll have to do another layer on top. Just make sure the underneath layer is dry already. Use my white gouache to paint the line on the ground and the reflection of the headlight of the ground support vehicle. This has to be done after it's dry, okay? If you do it while it's wet, it will just spread out and mess things up. This painting took quite a while to finish, not just because it's bigger, but also a lot of waiting to dry in between layers. I could probably use a hairdryer to make the drying speed way faster, but I rarely do that because I like to leave the painting there and let it paint itself a bit longer. The rest of the elements are pretty easy. They're just mostly dark shape with small suggestion of highlight. They just have to follow the right perspective and form. The ground support elements are there sort of as a counterweight. We have such a huge jet on the right, and we do need something on the left to counter that. They shouldn't be equal in size because your focus should be on the right, but for overall balance and composition, we do want to bring something on the left to sort of balance things out. Now I'm adding some dark shapes around the puddle to help the puddle pop out more and to make the ground a bit dirtier and more interesting. And some final touches of the tall light post. These are pretty important because they break the horizon line and give some more sense of parallax and perspective. And they also provide some vertical element in this painting because there's so much horizontal shapes going on. So I decided to add another figure just to make it look more interesting. Even though that figure is not in the original photo, we can always make things ourselves. So we don't have to copy everything the photo shows. It is our painting, so we do whatever we want, whatever that suits us, and whatever that helps the painting to become better. Use the white gouache to paint some highlight back, and we are finished. Thank you so much for watching, and again, this is one of my favorite paintings. You can check it out on my website. It is still available if you're interested. And while you're at my website, make sure you sign up to download a free PDF guide if you haven't. Thank you, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving holiday, and I'll see you next time.